Okay, hey, so we're going to jump into some discussions as we are wont to do. We're somewhat new to YouTube, but that doesn't mean we aren't the same opinionated jerks that we've been for a long time. We try and approach these things from, shall we say, an enlightened left perspective. And
I don't know about enlightened.
Yeah, that's a heavy word.
Fair.
And post-left.
We're going to
anti-boot perspective.
Oh my God, this is a circular firing squad, y'all. Anyway, we're gonna be talking about some recent shootings actually. So might as well get into it. While we go through this, I'm here with Dr. Nishay Deveneaux. I'm here with Brian Norman, and I'm here with Dave Nichols, and my name is Brian Pace.
The man accused of gunning down a pro-Trump supporter in Portland is now dead. Federal officials say agents shot and killed him while trying to make an arrest in Washington state. The suspect had said he is, quote, 100% Antifa and defended his actions during an interview that aired yesterday.
What I will say is that I felt that my life and other people around me's lives were in danger. And I felt like I had no choice but to do what I did.
That development coming as Portland nears 100 nights of protest.
Sorry.
If that man was a cop, he'd be off scot-free right there. He said the magic words. I felt scared for my life. Stand your ground's pretty clear. I'm pretty sure that Oregon's not a stand your ground state, but ultimately we're talking about self-defense, right? We have multiple armed individuals in different factions running around around Portland.
Yeah, and within the context of the carceral state, right, this is something that would get sorted out in a courtroom, in theory.
In theory.
But to do what I did.
That development coming as Portland nears 100 nights of protests, and other big cities are bracing for the possibility of more violence this weekend, including in New York City and certainly others. Jesse, let's go to you first. This is a man who is a father of two, and he had been protesting, all summer. I understand that he felt really committed to his cause, but he was making a choice, and the choice ended in his death.
God rest his soul. I know he leaves behind two children, but my goodness, just do one Google search on this guy. It's I don't want to speak badly of the dead, but it's not a pretty picture. And to a certain extent, it's not only Wheeler's fault, who's a total failure out there in Portland. This guy was picked up on gun charges just a couple weeks ago, and they dropped the charges. They didn't even prosecute him. He would have been in jail.
So, Jesse Waterman, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out like the disingenuity around like, God rest his soul and all that, or at least the apparent disingenuousness of that. But then beyond that, like if we're talking about perceptions and conceptualizations of gun rights and gun ownership within the US, I don't want to engage in whataboutism. However, like I suspect if we look at some of the positions that he's espoused in his career about Second Amendment rights and who gets to carry and when, the fact that there were past gun crimes is not necessarily relevant to whatever went down on that night, much of which is still being discussed. Additionally, this conceptualization of violence, right? As cities brace for violence tonight, usually what these folks are talking about is property destruction, right? There have been protests in which private property, corporate private property has been destroyed. The people who've actually been engaged in violence against other people, right, have been police, have been white supremacists, have been groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer, which we'll get into as they continue.
Yeah, Jesse Waters, I misspoke earlier, but Jesse Waters is somebody who, frankly, I mean, this is Fox News. None of these people are particularly reliable narrators. That said, it's been said anything that you say after "but" is meaningless, and so he says, God rest your soul, and I don't want to speak poorly of the dead, but, and then we go towards speaking poorly of the dead.
Yeah, they wouldn't have been able to do
whataboutism, but
sure,
whatever.
Do this to get on Vice while there's a fugitive task force looking to arrest you. and try to plead your case shows how arrogant and emboldened Antifa has become. They think they can get away with that.
Okay, so just, emboldened Antifa has become, on that point, he, from that Vice interview, was saying he's against fascists, but he's not formally identified with any kind of specific Antifa organization. And his sister has also spoken out about the fact that he's kind of an impulsive, person who acts kind of, in the moment. And when you're amping up these sorts of, clashes, you'll end up with people who are a little maybe even unwell and are trigger happy. And, that doesn't necessarily mean it's this part of this larger plot to, a representative of Antifa, whatever that means. So the fact that they're kind of riffing on this is disingenuous generally.
And for those of you who don't know, Antifa issues cards. So it actually looks like this. So if you've got one of these, you're part of the club.
And for whatever it's worth, right, this clash was provoked by a caravan of far-right and Trump supporters that were cruising through Portland, right? If we want to talk about the outside agitators narratives that have been spun throughout various protests of late and historically, like, it's quite clear that this was provoked by violent white supremacists and neo-fascists coming into Portland.
Yeah,
he's also making the assumption that this guy's going on Vice because he's just arrogant about what he did, not that, I am concerned that I'm going to be murdered
by cop.
Well, and he did say he was concerned about getting arrested. He was concerned, and part of the reason he ran, if I recall correctly, was that he was concerned that if he were arrested, the cops, who have been documented in numerous cases to be working, say, with the militia in Kenosha and with other far-right groups. In the case of the LA Sheriff's Department, they've got the Executioners gang and numerous other gangs in the police department or in the Sheriff's Department. He was concerned for his safety if he were taken into custody, which seems quite valid.
Absolutely. I should mention that I grew up in the protest culture of Portland. I haven't lived in Portland in about 10 years, but there were always elements like Patriot Warrior and Patriot Prayer and these far-right provocateurs that were spoiling for a fight all the way back to the 90s with, skinheads running around attempting to provoke people and stir up unrest. And all of these elements have been completely emboldened and given explicit license by President Donald Trump. So we're seeing there's a long history of Nazis going into leftist neighborhoods to essentially declare that they are violent while they're effectively provoking fights. None of these chuds are from Portland.
Well, it plays into this larger narrative about there being this kind of dark money, deep state funding Antifa. And this was even, as I was chatting with you guys about a few months ago, like even Erdogan in Turkey was trying to say like, the Kurds are like behind, they're scheming, they're part of this international, dark money attempt to overthrow states. And it's just, it's not.
Well, the funny thing is, while Trump talks about planes full of dark-clad, black-clad, Antifa protesters getting ready to throw soup cans, the reality is, if we look at one of the Proud Boys protests a couple weeks back in Portland, there was actually a train, the train that comes from the MAX, the train that comes from the airport, full of Proud Boys who had come to Portland specifically for that event. So. Those dynamics are there, just not in the way that gets discussed, and certainly not about Antifa in that context.
Let's get back to the video.
Stuff. The video evidence and the eyewitness testimony tells a completely different story about that shooting. From everything we know, this was not an act of self-defense. He wasn't saving anyone's life. This looks like cold-blooded murder. He would have gone away for life if he hadn't been shot by deputies.
But he was shot by deputies.
Right. And on top of that, like the actual case, so Aaron Danielson, who was the person who was killed in Portland, was found, not only was there a can of bear mace that it looks like he pulled in the video, not only was there a metal baton that he had been using throughout the day, but he was also found to have a sidearm and I think at least 3 additional clips or three magazines alongside him in his pockets, things like that. He was also out, and we'll probably get back to this later in the video, with Chandler Pappas, who is a violent right-wing advocate, member of, or at least affiliate of the Proud Boys, somebody who's been involved with people like Haley Adams, with Taylor Jernigan, who fired a sidearm out of a car several weeks back at the end of a protest after he and Alan Swinney were involved in macing and using paintball guns loaded with all sorts of wild, hard munitions or whatever in them. These are people who have track records of engaging in violence against anti-fascists, against basically showing up at protests in order to engage in violence against human beings.
And let's just clarify here, like violence against anti-fascists. These people show up at protests and beat the crap out of anybody that they can corner from the other side.
Totally.
So, I mean, I was making a joke earlier about, being a card-carrying member of anti-fascism. And the joke is that I'm actually the leader of Antifa. Just kidding. No, I mean, like, if you are against fascism, then you're, you are Antifa. But like, there are a lot of just citizens, concerned citizens coming out to protests with no organized affiliation at all. And then they're getting the crap kicked out of them by, Proud Boys wearing steel-toed boots and bear mace and, spiked bats and all the things that you were mentioning earlier.
Well, and as I saw someone point out online a few days ago, like there's been a lot of talk, even I've experienced since I was a kid, learning about the Holocaust and having people say, oh, if I was back then, like, I wouldn't have gone along with it. I would have stood up to the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. And yet people standing up to stuff right now is portrayed as an unbearably horrible thing to do, which, like, you can't have it both ways.
No.
And he was shot because he pulled out a rifle as they approached him. We warned this was going to happen. What did we say about Chop or Chaz? You let this thing go, someone's going to die, and they died. We've been saying for 100 days in Portland.
Real quick, just 2 seconds. It's worth noting that someone did die at Chop or Chaz, and that's a huge problem and something that the left or post-left or anarchists, particularly white anarchists, have done a pretty shitty job of engaging with. This isn't to say that resistance to fascism is straightforward or simple. There are things to work out in autonomous zones, but also like equating this and presenting themselves as somehow morally outraged around this just doesn't seem coherent.
Oh, I want to interject that what are you talking about? Somebody's going to die. The entire movement, the cause of this whole thing is that Black lives are being murdered at an unacceptable, like there's no acceptable level for extrajudicial murder in the United States. People are already dying. That's the whole point.
Yeah, and this came after the Rittenhouse murders.
Right.
But even in the RNC, like it's been pointed out that I think it was Pence who referred to like our Black neighbors, making a clear distinction between his audience as being not Black and the neighbors. So it's like they're
and also that was in the context of Americans, right? It was like Americans and our Black neighbors. As
exactly.
Though,
right. So it's like it doesn't mean the same thing to a lot of these people.
Someone's going to die, and now they're dead. And it's funny the way the media characterizes this. The media speaks.
It's just so funny to hear these people who are like on television, major. They're not indie. They're not like some kind
They're
of.
The biggest
small,
cable. They're the biggest cable outlet that's
like,
out there.
The media. Yeah. It's like, what are you even doing?
Speaks nicely about the shooter and kind of denigrates the guy that was shot dead. They're calling this guy, labeling the dead guy like some right-wing Trump-supporting militia Patriot member, and then they whitewash this guy who's about as radical as they come. It's sad. They're lying to you.
For whatever it's worth, you know, Danielson was wearing a Patriot Prayer hat. He was out in the streets with Papas. Like, these are people who have established histories of engaging with far-right groups. I think the notion that this is somehow an inaccurate portrayal just isn't the case.
Well, when you label yourself, it's pretty hard. Like, look, the guy who, you know, had a fist tattoo on his neck, who was just gunned down by police, he labeled himself as Antifa. It's fair to say that he was Antifa. The guy wearing a Patriot Prayer hat, it's fair to say that he was affiliated with that group.
And this is exactly what Goebbels did in the rise of the Nazis. He would, when there was the clashes between the Nazis and the socialists, or the Nazis and the communists, they would pick a specific killing. And, you know, at the time, the Nazis were out of control in the buildup in the 30s with violence in the streets. And, you know, Goebbels would take a case like this, make that guy like he was a martyr or a hero, and then amplify that to, you know, to draw more of, you know, these younger kind of lost guys into the party. This is very standard.
And I think it's really going to backfire.
Greg, what about the fact that a lot of these gun crimes basically don't get prosecuted? They let them go, and then it exacerbates the problem.
Is this the first time that Fox News has gotten upset about the prosecution of gun crimes, or is it just that the individuals involved are white that's ringing my bells here? Like, what?
Well, there's an explicit part where they make a very clear dog whistle, I think, down the line about urban gun owners in a way that, yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Let's get there.
Yeah, it's not just this guy. You know, he was busted and let go. This happens a lot in other cities with handguns, especially. If they can't control the handguns in inner cities, how are they going to have a national gun control plan is what I don't understand. I applaud the feds for making the world safer by eliminating an armed, murderous hooligan.
So we have
the
variables involved. Extrajudicial killing.
Yeah,
right
he just
here,
applauded
you know.
Murder. Yeah.
Dylan Roof, countless other, you know, white supremacist gunmen have been brought in without being murdered extrajudicially. The notion that somehow this is what needed to go down in this
rifle
case.
in hand.
It relates to, if anyone hasn't seen it, ContraPoints' recent video on justice and just the kind of emotional satisfaction that, you know, the cops identifying with I forget the superhero who was like, you know, killing
Punisher.
Punisher, exactly.
Which is ridiculous.
But this is this exact vibe that she was talking about.
Right.
This, like, you know, the laws get in the way here, you know, when it's this kind of situation. But, you know, when the tables are turned, they have a completely different set of talking points.
Right. I only say it's ridiculous because the creator of The Punisher has come out and said that he absolutely abhors the fact that his character is being used as a police mascot, because in the backstory of The Punisher, yeah, he does not like corrupt cops at all.
Whoopsie.
Sorry, I'm a nerd.
Involved in his life, whether he was a family man or involved in a cause, I don't care. I really don't care. I think the lesson every group needs to learn is that you don't have to glorify a martyr because of their skin color. I am not going to call in sick over this guy because he's white.
That line, like, that's one of the lines, like, I was like, we got to talk about this video. It's like, making an equivalence between anyone kneeling on a football field is like the same as him, you know, because it connects to the talking points about the NBA, these privileged people who are able to just decide not to come into work today because, you know, he's like, I'm going to still come into work just because this is a white guy. And, like, you know, should I be calling out sick? No, it's not the same thing at all.
No, it isn't, and it's pretty ridiculous seeing that played out.
All right, he murdered a citizen, and Jesse's right. I've already seen certain kinds of language that are being employed to kind of portray him as a martyr because he believed in a cause. I'm sorry, you know. This started when the media deliberately mislabeled violence as protest, justified the actions of miscreants. We knew the violence was happening. We were told by people in the media that we were crazy, even as the killings spiked. We
had like these issues of violence and how violence functions as a floating signifier. I mean, Fox News has repeatedly championed imperial wars, has celebrated all sorts of, you know, violence as perpetrated by the state. I mean, this guy literally just celebrated the extrajudicial killing of Reinoehl. Like, the notion that he is somehow opposed or morally offended by violence is simply a non-starter. It's about these issues
like 2 seconds ago. Yeah.
Right. It's about where it's directed. It's about who gets to use it. It's about, you know, this is what we get into when we talk about police having a monopoly, the state having a monopoly on violence, and cops representing the manifestation of that monopoly on violence. That is legitimate violence. That is good violence. That is, you know, the violence that these folks want to see and think should be normalized. That's the violence that maintains so-called social peace.
Well, in legitimate violence, the root word for legitimate means lawful.
Yep.
I think we have now a 50% increase in murder in New York, which we mentioned yesterday. And we are told that we are just sensationalizing this. If people listen to us, they were...
The outrage. Like, he's like, we were calling this, you know, as we were helping to fan the flames, we knew this was coming and we should have been listened to. It's like, it's almost Karen-like, the even like body language this guy is putting off.
Be two men alive right now, that guy and the Trump supporter.
Geraldo, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't miss him. I think Jesse's way too compassionate. This was a confessed killer. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. You pull a gun on a federal fugitive task force and you expect to survive. I mean,
what
shows,
happened
you know,
to this guy? What happened to this guy? Go back to getting chairs thrown at you.
or opening empty safes.
This is the thing. You live by the gun, you die by the gun, except that that's not, you know, if we assume that they believe in the law and order, which you know, certainly doesn't seem that way, that's not how the judicial system is supposed to function.
It's not. And let alone the whole layer of like mental health and like people, you know, being able to de-escalate situations where unwell people are around weapons in this country because they're everywhere. You know, it's like, it shouldn't just be okay, you get to die now.
And we have numerous cases of, you know, we can look at the Aurora, Colorado shooter. We can look at the Texas, the El Paso Walmart shooter. We can look at case after case of white supremacist shooters who have been taken into custody while armed without an issue. Those people may have lived by the gun, so to speak, but they certainly didn't die by the gun.
Right. Breaking gun crimes or breaking gun laws still means that, you know, you go to like a court of law.
In theory.
Last time I checked.
You know, they are so living in their own bubble. You didn't want to blame Mayor Wheeler, but they've allowed for 100 days this anarchy, this disorder, this disruption, this violence, this mugging, this usurping of private property, trashing everything. You know,
hey, let's stop here
defying the
real
rule of law.
The usurping of private property is the thing that they're mainly concerned about. This is the main issue. This is the disorder. There is a whole bunch of chaos that these are the people who don't care about climate change. These are the people who don't care about bombing entire cities. There is a certain kind of disorder that fits into their orderly worldview. And then there's the usurping of private property that gets Geraldo frothing at the mustache.
Right, and gets him to invoke some false notion of 100 days of muggings, you know, as the police are actively beating people night after night. Like, if you've seen the footage from Portland, like, you know, it's quite clear who is committing violence against human beings. Again, the notion of violence against property, particularly private property, particularly the violence that it takes to maintain corporate private property. It's an absurd proposition in the first place. And the fact that these guys get so amped up, as you point out, Pace, over, you know, and advocate for these extrajudicial or killings or illegal wars or drone strikes or what have you, the fact that then they go around thumping whatever about law and order, it's nonsensical. It's not law and order, it's their hierarchy.
Yeah, so one more thing, which would be that the usurping of private property, even that, just as we've revisited with the violence discussion about who it's directed against, quantitatively, if we're talking about mugging and usurping private property, police have seized more in civil seizure laws.
Forfeiture, yeah.
Forfeitures, thank you.
Yep.
More private property than all burglaries and muggings combined in a quantitative monetary value. So, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and if we wanted to broaden it as far as other things, you know, we can look at wage theft as being a far larger theft, you know,
white collar crime.
Employers. And then if we wanted to get kind of absurdist and funny as far as like human and broader ecological costs, we can look at forest fires from gender reveal parties doing more damage than anti-fascist protesters. So, you know.
Killing someone in cold blood at point blank range. This is where you end up. This should have happened 50 days.
I mean, but what about the Kenosha kid? Like, isn't that like what? Like what he just said?
Don't worry about
Look,
that.
he drove from out of state, carried a long rifle illegally. It appears, like, you know, killed 2 people, wounded another, but, you know, he was doing it in defense of property. Again, like, he literally picked up a weapon to protect property, so it's justified. That becomes justifiable self-defense.
Still at point blank, like what he just said, like still applies there. So yeah, property defense seems to be the defining difference.
Days ago or 100 days ago, this was, you know,
99 days ago.
This Antifa thug is exactly what the president is complaining about. These people flying between cities, you know, bringing their, you know, their violence with them, conspiring with others to disrupt, taking naive, innocent protesters and bending them to their diabolical purpose. This guy was a terrorist, and he died a terrorist death.
Outside agitators.
Wow.
It's just like
This
the
sounds
rhetoric.
like a crazy person on
Bending
the
to
street.
your will.
Yeah, it's so like they talk about the bubble that exists in the media and stuff, and it's like so clear what they're doing as being super biased and us versus like one law for me and one for thee or whatever it is. You know, it's like it doesn't. The rhetoric just belies their hypocrisy at every turn. And yet, if you scroll through the YouTube comments, I don't know. It's people being like, and can you believe that CNN, people actually believe what they're seeing on CNN, as if it's CNN that's, I mean, I'm not that I'm pro CNN, but I'm saying that people seemingly buy fully into this very, in my opinion, biased perspective that Fox is promoting.
CNN is too busy telling us how peaceful Iraq war vote for Joe Biden was. Actually.
I mean, look, we've all read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. It's not like we're big fans of corporate media. But what I got to say is that, like, the rhetoric that Mr. Geraldo is using is specifically designed to rile up grandpa, who does not understand why the kids are doing unfamiliar things, and it must be because an evil supervillain anti-fascist bent them to their will.
Well, you know, I mean, and to that end, like, it makes me curious what Laura Ingraham would do in this context. Ingram? Okay, yeah, not because I'm interested in what would Laura Ingraham do, but because we actually saw her push back against Trump peddling those very minorly, very,
yeah,
you know.
That sounds like a conspiracy theory.
Right, and like, would she do that here, or is this enough of a, you know, whatever, Fox circle jerk that it wouldn't be an issue? I'm
she'd just say,
curious.
settle down, Geraldo. That's what she'd say.
Dagan, let's get a final thought from you.
The feds are on the case. Governor Kate Brown still refusing to call in the National Guard into Portland. The DA, Mike Schmidt of Multnomah County, not prosecuting many of those people arrested. But Attorney General Bill Barr said earlier this week that he talked about radicals crossing state lines and carrying out planned coordinated attacks on law enforcement, public property, and on private property. Guess what? That means, and Andy McCarthy wrote about this, that the Justice Department is going to be converting, looking at these federal.
This is the same Bill Barr that doesn't know whether or not it's illegal to vote twice, right? Like this is the Bill Barr we're discussing. You know, the notion that he's anything other than a political operative, the notion that there's any sort of judicial independence within the context of the Trump administration, you know, again, these are opportunists who are recognizing that there is a political moment here and the opportunity to leverage some of these systems and push and advance certain narratives. And that, you know, in the context of what we're seeing play out both in the streets and in the halls of government is kind of terrifying.
Federal crimes, converting state crimes into federal crimes, crossing state lines, coupled with kind of a loose criminal organization, that's a racketeering enterprise. So you're talking about the feds being in charge.
Yeah, no, it completely applies to the far right, like everything you just said there.
Charged now. We're talking about long sentences for these crimes to prevent murder potentially. So sanctuary city no more.
That's a huge non sequitur, by the way, because this entire conversation has nothing to do with illegal immigrants. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, it also just ignores the dynamics around Portland. It ignores like who came from where and for what purposes. This notion of like trolling the libs or whatever, while you've got masked up, blacked out license plates, and you're firing mace and paintball guns and hopping out of your trucks to beat people. I mean, the amount of footage that came out from that.
According to Trump, paintball and pepper spray is just a defensive.
Yes, but if you put paint on a statue, then it should be a federal offense and you should be looking at potentially decades in jail. I mean, again, we're not expecting any sort of ideological consistency here, but I've encountered a number of people in psychedelic spaces who are very adamant that there's some sort of I don't know, they call it either over wokeness or something like that, or that there's this predatory wokeness, that anti-fascists are the real fascists. All of these lines where they talk about violence, but it's not violence in a systemically understood, historically contextualized manner. It's this notion of this abstracted specter of violence as divorced from all contexts. And those people who are railing against that violence, like, do they think violence would have been incorrect in overthrowing or resisting American chattel slavery or the Nazis? Or like there are clear cases where I suspect most people you know, like
pretty much.
And basically right now, Dave, some of the things that you're saying are making me feel uncomfortable, and I don't like it. And actually, I don't think I want to have this conversation anymore because you're a little too woke. So maybe we should just not agree to disagree, you know?
Cool.
At a Starbucks with your Antifa card. Anyway, that's our little spiel for today. Thanks for bearing with us. This little outlet for crazy times. We have a podcast. We're occasionally doing stuff on YouTube. Yeah, follow us, Psymposia, plus3. Thanks. See you next time.